Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. This week I want to talk about Promises, the collaborative album between Floating Points, Pharoah Sanders, and the London Symphony Orchestra. Sam Shepard, brilliant musician, who I've posted on before, got his start as a classical pianist, moved into jazz, moved into DJing, did DJ work while he was getting his neuroscience degree, and is now not only a respected intellectual in the field, but also a great musical talent with a lot of really broad ideas about what's possible in music. This album just continues to cement my respect for him as a musician and as a forward-thinking musical experimenter. And not too long ago, I talked a little bit about the idea of the dissolution of genres, that genres in some cases, it's not like you're crossing genres, but the barriers between genres are starting to dissolve, become new things. This is an album I think that falls into that category because although it is orchestral, it's not an orchestral album. Although it's jazz, it's not really a jazz album. And although it's kind of an ambient DJ album, it's kind of not that. It's all of these things at once. And it's not like you're taking facets of different things to make it happen. They've blended together to create an entirely new experience. Now, my understanding is that Sam Shepard did a lot of the writing for this, although there's a strong improvised component to it on behalf of Pharoah Sanders and Floating Point Sam Shepard himself. The writing that went into this is mostly from his pen. I don't know if he did the orchestrations on this album for the London Symphony Orchestra, but if he did, it's one more feather to put in his hat. It's amazing stuff. Now, this album is a very meditative experience overall, to the point where an initial just sort of cursory listen may not allow you to understand its depths. You have to kind of come at this album listening to it in a certain way, or else you're going to miss details. It'll probably be a great experience for you because the feeling of the album is very emotive. It's very soothing, but at the same time, very adventurous. But to get all that out of it, it takes a little bit of investment. So the primary organizing principle that I see on Promises is this thing that I call the chime, and it's this. That set of 7 notes, that sequence of 7 notes, is repeated insistently throughout the course of this album. Across every single movement, it makes some sort of appearance. Now, for the first about 2/3 of the album, it's pretty much that sequence of notes with some alterations to kind of fit different harmonic structures. Maybe a note changed here, a note changed there, but it's very ambiguous. So it allows both Pharoah Sanders and the London Symphony Orchestra and all these different components to interact with it in a way that brings it all together. When I perceive the opening chime of this piece as a set of 30-second notes, okay, then I can continue to think of that same tempo and it will give me a chime roughly every 6 beats. If I go like 32 beats a minute, very, very slow tempo. But it's one of the things that really allows this piece to have such a continuous pulse. After a while, after listening through the piece, you start to hear where the chime happens, and which gives him the latitude to destruct the chime as it gets further along in the piece. Now, it's a challenge to hear a tempo that slow and keep it consistent when it's mostly based against silence. So I find it interesting to kind of try to keep pulse with this and try to find ways in which the rest of the environments and events in Promises kind of interact with that pulse. And I think that there's enough times when that happens to justify the possibility of that pulse being there. Especially if you consider the possibility that at the end of every 6 beats or so, every now and then, there's some rubato that pulls back the tempo. And the times where I feel like that might be happening, where the chime is just a little bit late, the beginning part of the chime is pulled back in tempo a little bit, it feels like. So if you see the chime as this boat that's just floating across a very vast, open, sort of metaphysical sea, then the person steering the boat is Pharoah Sanders. And this is the thing where it really gets interesting because Pharoah Sanders is clearly not reading notes. There's not written parts as much for Pharoah Sanders on this. He's using the chime and that set of notes as a starting point. There's not a whole bunch of extreme highs or extreme lows or extreme fast notes kind of things that Pharoah Sanders is doing here. He's using that as a set of notes to start just exploring the environments that the chime is taking us through throughout the course of all 9 of these movements. There are movements in here where some elements stick out more than others. Movement 3 is more of an ambient piece for Sam Shepard. Like movement 2 is kind of, movement 1 and movement 2 is kind of more where Pharoah Sanders would come to the fore. Movement number 7 is a huge one where Pharoah Sanders almost gets into some free jazz and like his history, like a little bit more cacophonous sounds. And it's also very interesting too whenever you start to see Sam Shepard get into more ambient and complex sounds. I think that Pharoah Sanders is actually sometimes even interacting with upper harmonics and very subtle things in the musical environments that he's finding himself in. Now, it's very clear to me that the interplay between Pharoah Sanders and Sam Shepard is the primary venue by which this album realizes itself. It's very easy to lay it all on the lap of one or the other, but I think that in some ways Sam Shepard can kind of go toe to toe with Pharoah Sanders. Of course, Pharoah Sanders is a jazz legend, so it's kind of presumptuous to say that. And I don't think that maybe Sam Shepard quite has the same experience or maybe even the same chops. But his concept is so big, and his idea about what's possible in ambient electronic music is so curious that I got to respect that, And there's parts in here where he gets into playing just some straight Fender Rhodes jazz-style interactions with Pharoah Sanders. He has those kinds of chops. So a lot of ground is covered here on Pharoah Sanders' side and on Sam Shepard's side. But I don't want to downplay the contribution of the London Symphony Orchestra, the strings specifically. The London Symphony Orchestra strings. There's no brass on this one. He just has incorporated the strings into this. I'm not exactly sure how all of the arrangements worked. I would love to find out. I would love for Sam Shepard to sit down and talk to me about what kind of compositional approaches he took when he was making the orchestral aspects of this album. But for me, the climax of Promises is movement 6. Movement 6 is clearly the sort of the orchestral feature in this one. It's a 9-minute movement, and the orchestra pretty much just takes over. Which means that movement 7, 8, 9 are kind of a denouement after 6. And that would seem like a long time to come off of that climax. But that time isn't wasted, because after they get past that point, you start to see Sam Shepard deconstruct the chime to where it just becomes a mere gesture towards the end. And because you've heard it for so long throughout the course of the piece, you can still perceive it, even though it's barely being played, 1 or 2 notes here and there, or maybe just chord changes happening where the chime would be happening at its completion every 6 beats at 33 beats per minute. Now, if I seem really passionate about this album, it's because I am. I think this is a really innovative work and crosses a lot of boundaries. If I was going to say it was one thing or the other, I would have to say it's kind of more of a jazz album than anything else because the improvisatory component is so front and center with it. There's a lot of organization, but there's organization in jazz too. That's not weird. But definitely the interactions between Sam Shepard and Pharoah Sanders have a very organic quality to them. Matter of fact, if you're listening to it, you can almost hear Sam Shepard sometimes resetting the registers on the harpsichord. It almost has this ASMR quality on it. It works extremely well on headphones. And listening to it in that way, it gives you a real opportunity to hear all of the amazing details that are embedded in this album. In parts that you might think, just listening to it over a regular speaker, are just silence because it's so sparse. But in those sparse moments, huge little ecosystems of sounds and textures that add up to the whole thing. Now, of course, there are written out parts to it, but in some ways, you look at what Miles Davis was doing with Jill Evans. That Jill Evans was providing these very relatively strict arrangements of big band songs that Miles Davis would use to improvise within. So, I think that comparing this to maybe some of the work that Jill Evans was doing with Miles Davis might not be too far off. Definitely a 21st century version of that. What happens when contemporary DJs and producers work with jazz folks, not just on the terms of jazz or in the terms of DJ production, but really find a common ground and try to find something new, a way to do something different. Now, I'm not saying that this has never been done before. It's always dangerous to say that. I've never heard anything that takes this idea of the chime, this almost minimalist idea, and stretches it throughout the course of the entire recording so effectively. But it does it, and it really helps to bring the whole thing together and provides continuity in an album that really could almost fall apart under the weight of its own ideas. But given that piece is so constant, it holds together beautifully and has just immense amount of texture and environments that are there to be explored, and with Pharoah Sanders at the head of the boat, just pointing to what you should be looking at the entire time. I think this album has a lot of legs for me. It's a very innovative piece of work that I really have grown to love, and I see it as almost a meditation. You can parse it out to where the 6 beats per minute at 32 could almost be like breathing. Breathe in very slowly and then out right when the chime happens. It invites that kind of listening. So clear some time. Sit down with this album and check it out. It does not break up well into sound bites. So if you're listening to the sound bites on this and you don't really get it, or if you just heard one track, you don't really get it, it's because this piece really has to be hit as a whole experience. And not just, into little sound bites. And that's not how we listen to stuff very often these days. And that's too bad, because if you're unable to take the time to really sit down with this album and engage with it and absorb it, you'll be missing out. So I highly suggest this album. Please do your best to clear some time and check it out. But that's all I have to say about it this week. So if you like this video, please like it, subscribe to it, share it out with your friends. Also follow me over on Spotify. We'll put a movement from Promises up over there, even though it's going to feel a little bit out of place without the entire thing to listen to. And I'll come at you guys next week with more to listen to. Also, I don't know if you've seen this, but I've been putting up some elimination rounds as I've been getting ready for 2021. Floating Points, Pharoah Sanders for collaboration just went on last week, so keep your eyes open for those too. Until you see you next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.
You know.